Yeah, look at this.
Let's talk about unrestricted climbs.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
Hello, everybody. It's Monday. I'm Mover. Today, we're going to talk about unrestricted quick climbs, Zoom climbs. You've known them as many different words, but they're all pretty much the same thing. You see them a lot at air shows, Fast Jet Fridays, cross countries, or sometimes just because. And why do fighters do unrestricted climbs? Is it just because they're cool, or is there actually a reason? So first, what's the difference between a normal climb and an unrestricted climb? So typically, your departure requires at least 200 feet per nautical mile on climb out. That's not a whole lot. So what fighters typically do, and this is based off the fighters that I've flown, I don't know all the different fighters, but it's pretty standard across the board. Typically, as a flight lead, you'll take off and capture 300 knots and use a known power setting and pitch setting to climb up to, it's a segmented climb. So typically you'll have like an altitude that you're initially climbing to 4,000 feet, whatever the local procedures dictate. And then you'll climb up to above 10,000 feet. In that space between taking off and getting to 10,000 feet AGL, you're usually holding about 300 knots. Some do 350, but most of the fighters that I've flown, 300 knots. And you might ask, well, what about the 250 below 10? Does not apply to fighter aircraft. We have waivers based on NATOPS limitations and Dash 1 limitations. That's a different video altogether, but usually it relates to performance, so the ability to maneuver and your visibility, because slower speeds, your nose is pitched up more, it's harder to see traffic out there. So fighters have a waiver, 250 below 10 and 200 knots in certain airspace. Doesn't apply to us. So you get to 10,000 feet, then you pitch over and accelerate to 350 knots, and typically we'll be at 350 knots all the way to whatever block altitude we're assigned to. So why would we do an unrestricted climb? Well, first, it looks cool. I mean, it's a lot of fun and it looks cool. Typically, you'll see this on like Fast Jet Fridays, Burner Fridays, where they'll request it, and it's just kind of like a morale builder. Not only does it increase the morale of the pilots, but those watching, because who doesn't want to see a fighter doing an unrestricted climb? Air shows, again, part of the air show thing, usually static displays or whatever when they depart. That's part of it. Cross countries, you see that a lot. I've done them on cross countries for the sole reason of it gets you out of whatever airspace you're in faster. So typically, like if you go cross country to New Orleans or something like that, got a Bravo airspace, you got a lot of civilian traffic. And for a fighter, anytime you're around civilian traffic, that's probably one of the most dangerous things you can do. So getting that quick climb, that unrestricted climb out of that airspace up to a higher altitude is always a good thing. Next, it's more fuel efficient. Believe it or not. So yes, you may burn a little bit more fuel low altitude, but the faster you can get up to high altitude, the more fuel efficient the jet becomes. So getting out of that low altitude environment actually saves fuel. So if you're in a situation where fuel might be a little bit, you might want to do the quick climb to get you up to altitude faster. Now, some jets have different performance capabilities. If you're in a two-bag Viper, you're not going to have the same performance as a clean F-16. Clean F-16 can accelerate in the vertical. It's got a higher than 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio. So when you're going straight up, the jet's still accelerating. Some jets, they'll start to slow down as you start climbing, so you can't go as high. Incentive flights, I always did them on incentive flights because it's just part of the show. And that's usually where people might get sick on that first initial pull and climb. And another reason you might do it is tactically speaking. You may have a threat just outside the wire of the airport, so just outside of the perimeter, and you want to get high enough, fast enough, so that you're not a threat from small arms fire or anything like that. So you're trying to get up higher, faster. So how do you do the unrestricted climb? You take off, pick the gear up, hold it low altitude as safely as you can. And then while you're still in the airport structure, you don't want to go too far outside of the airport environment. Getting that 400 to 500 knots, it just depends on what jet you're in and what the performance factors are. Is it a hot day? Is it a cold day? Cold day, better performance, low altitude, low field elevation, high density altitude. Or do you have stores? Are you a 2-bag, 200, 370 gallon tank kind of configuration? Or is it a clean jet or whatever? Whatever that case may be, you capture that speed and then you go straight vertical. I once had an older fighter pilot tell me that if you're doing it to look cool, anything above 45 degrees is a waste because from the ground, nobody can tell. But typically that's what you're looking for, that 45 to 60 degrees. 90 is not really a thing. You don't really gain much by doing that. And you really, if you're going to do 90 and bullseye, so straight up, you need a jet that can do it. So you'd probably need a Raptor that's not very heavy, or you need an F-16 clean that's got that 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio. So typically we're not going all the way to 90, although it might look like 90 from the ground. So at that point, you're trying to capture your altitude. So typically when you request it, you request the quick climb or the unrestricted climb to a certain altitude, usually in the teens, depending on the aircraft. Some might scoff and say we go all the way to the flight levels. That depends on aircraft performance. Pro tip, you don't want to request something that your jet can't do, because there's nothing more embarrassing than saying, hey, I want the quick climb to flight level 210, 21,000 feet, and your jet can only get to about 16 or 17,000 feet. So typically we ask for what's realistic. And same thing, you don't want something too low because you'll blitz through the altitude. So, if you say, hey, I want the quick climb to 10,000 feet and you're in a clean F-16, you're going to go blitzing right through that altitude fairly quickly. Not that cool. So typically, conservatively 14 to 16,000 feet. It's a good number on a cross country or something like that. But you want something that you can actually realistically get to. And as you start approaching that, knowing that your climb rate can be tens of thousands of feet per minute, you want to start to capture that. And the way we do it is by a roll and pull. So positive G on the aircraft, because number one, negative G suck. And number two, you can usually pull more positive G than negative G. For example, I can do 4 Gs positive, relatively easy, but the aircraft typically cannot do a negative 4G pushover because it's not a MiG-28. Also because it's uncomfortable, and you can under G the stores because your aircraft has higher positive G limits than it does negative G. Same thing with stores. So we typically like to do positive G. It's more comfortable, works out better. This is all done in visual meteorological conditions. You're not doing this in the weather because you'll spatially disorient yourself, and it's a more controlled environment when everybody's under IMC rules versus if it's a VFR day and it's just a nice day outside. So they won't always give it to you. I requested it several times on my Finney flight.
MX1 enable quick climb. Runway 1 when 340 at 13 clear for takeoff. Change your departure.
And MX1, if we go 30, can we get the quick climb?
MX1 negative.
Any way to get the quick climb?
1 negative, we got airspace active.
Copy, runway heading to 3000, MX1.
Sometimes they can't, whether it's because if you're at a military base, they can't get the airspace above. They cannot coordinate with the center, so the civilian controllers outside, or there's traffic conflicts or whatever. Because remember, you're going from talking to tower to talking to usually a center frequency and skipping approach. Sometimes you'll go to approach, but usually you're skipping that intermediary frequency and sector that you would have already otherwise talked to. So sometimes they can get it, sometimes it's approved, and sometimes not so much. Anyway, that's the quick and dirty on unrestricted quick climbs, zoom climbs, whatever you want to call them. They're a lot of fun. I enjoy doing them as one of my favorite things to do as a fighter pilot. And in the style of Gonky, I'm now going to leave you with just pure jet noise, not me talking, me doing an unrestricted climb in an F-18 A+. I had gone to New Orleans cross country because usually on the weekends we couldn't go back to Navy New Orleans. So if we were cross country in the local area doing proficiency training, instrument approaches, stuff like that, we'd have to go back to New Orleans, which was nice because then I could just drive home. And I was leaving New Orleans and got the quick climb. I think it was only to 14,000 feet. Obviously, you can't see. You're just looking at me. But here is the unedited, unrestricted climb. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching. See you later.